We got the rate cut. It was 0.5%. It was in 2001 as it was in 2007. When we had the rate cuts, the first rate cuts in 2019, eventually the Fed dropped rates down to nothing with the pandemic. That was a 1/4 point cut to kick that off in 2019. Fed gave the market what it wants. Market stalling at resistance, turning negative for the session, doing something a little different than it's done before to get the big rally. And we've had a rally going into the Fed, so do keep that in mind. But it's now coming off like a sell the news event. We can get a pullback off the trend line on the NASDAQ and Bitcoin, as I've been talking about. The direct overhead resistance on the S&P attempted to close at a new high today, could not do it. Two takeaways here. It initially rallied with the bigger cut. Then by the time Powell, the press conference, began to sell off ahead of it, rallied during the press conference, but it ended up turning lower. Methinketh Powell protesteth too much. Showing us how good the labor market is. Again, I've talked about the concerns that, hey, if they go bold, the market's going to go, well, why do they feel the need they have to do that? The thing is that trying to play catch up because they should have started at the last July meeting. Initially, the jumbo cut was celebrated, but during the press conference began to raise concerns, and towards the end of the session, Fed might be trying to get ahead of potential economic weakness. Again, financial channels that continue to promote the propaganda. We're going to have the soft landing. All again, over and over. How strong the economy is. Earlier in the week said, we can't have a topping process in a bear market right now because recession. By the time the recession hits, the market will have already begun to price it in. That's what these people don't understand. Now, on CNBC, they had Claudia Sahm, the of the SOM rule, the 3-month moving average. It goes above of the unemployment rate. When it goes above the low from the last 12 months, it's predicting a recession. It's predicting a recession right now. But yet she's even ignoring the thing about these experts. She's even ignoring her own indicator, which has been accurate for decades. She's violating her own rule, which her indicator is great, predicting a recession. So is the uninverting of the yield curve. Just want to tell us, no, we're going to have this soft landing, and this is just nothing but propaganda. All kept going. The economy's in a good place. That was the theme of the press conference. The economy's in a good place. I think Mr. Powell protesteth too much. We are seeing the weakness with the labor market. And remember, we got that jobs revision that the Labor Department had overestimated by 818,000 jobs, March of 2023 to March of 2024. There's got to be more revisions. We're seeing the weak numbers come out. He was asked about this stuff. He acknowledged, not so many words, that the Labor Department is overestimating the amount of jobs. Basically, we're getting fake numbers of an election out of the Labor Department. That's really what it comes down to. Going on, how the U.S. economy is in a good place. The U.S. economy is strong. Inflation is coming down. The market is in a solid place. We want to keep it there, and that's why we're going with this 0.5% cut. The real reason is they're concerned about the labor market, and that's why the market sold off. Talked about, again, previously, if the Fed does go 0.5%, the market's eventually going to go, well, why do they feel the need that they have to go 0.5%? Really downplayed it, showing a little concern about the labor market, but really almost dismissing it, having growing confidence in the strength of the labor market. He constantly talked about that. So I think Mr. Powell protesteth too much. What is that from Hamlet? Shakespeare there. Thanks the lady, protesteth too much. So Powell denying and saying how wonderful the economy is. Again, the opposite. With the labor market, anyways, is probably true. And the financial experts on the financial channels, the Fed's now normalizing rates. The bull market is now starting. Again, we are likely in a topping process. I still think the S&P will go higher, get a closing high above the July peak. It hasn't done that yet. It's had intraday pushes above it. But real fast, the Fed thinks that inflation will come down 2.3% by the end of this year, 0.1% by the end of next year in 2025. I think rates will be, by the end of 2024, 4.4%, and by the end of 2025, 3.4%. Initially, the Fed is not going to drop rates dramatically, or QE up all over. Not saying they won't do that later. at this point with inflation, they can't do that. And that's where people need to compare this to 2020 and 2021 when they should be comparing it to 2000, rate cut in 2001 and 2007. Talked about this at great length and detail. How confident the labor market growth can be maintained. Balderdash, poppycock, and falderall. You're going to see negative jobs. I promise you. Look in the next few months. We're going to have a recession in the next 3 to 6 months. See the unemployment rate rise. You're going to see the jobs go negative, the job growth go negative. It's already. I mean, we're getting, there are reasons why we've had these positive numbers. A lot of it is government hiring. A lot of it is, they're fudging the numbers. They're cooking the books. Talked about that at great length and detail. Again, the Labor Department is absolutely incredible. The amount of fake data that we're. Please support the channel. If you like the indicators, if you like the charts, please let me know that by supporting the channel. Take a moment to do that. I would really, really appreciate it. I just put it all out there for free and ask that you do what you can, help out, but I need to hear from you in order to make it work. So if you could just follow the link below to take you to a secured site, donate any amount you want or make it a recurring donation. If you do that, I thank you. You could take a moment to help out. I would really, really appreciate it. You got topping tails on the daily charts today. I'll talk about that in the video, but this moment is still bullish. If we start getting confirmation to the topping tails, momentum can flip back to bearish. But right now at the moment it's bullish, and we have a bullish reversal of conditions. Momentum still positive, but we had this gray shaded area telling us something's about to happen. Over here, it gave us this move down here. Over here, it gave us this bigger move down here. One at the bottom that gave us the rally up. So again, this is suggesting we're about to get a big move up or down, but we're at horizontal resistance on the S&P, rising resistance on the Dow, and declining resistance on the NASDAQ. We'll see in this video. You're watching if momentum tries to flip back to bearish, and if so, just how big of a sell-off do we get? Do we just get a pullback and build momentum? I think S&P will end up closing above the July peak. We've had 2 attempts to have an intraday push above it. I think eventually we will see a close above it, but it's looking like we're going to get the news event with the Fed pivot resistance levels I've talked about, rising resistance for the Dow, horizontal resistance for the S&P, and the declining trend line for the NASDAQ. Again, momentum shifted back to bullish with NASDAQ and S&P. We'll be watching to see if it remains that way. Got this gray shaded area. So a squeeze move up or down is getting ready to happen. We did get the topping tail, so we'll be watching. Thinking the NASDAQ, oh, it's breaking the trend line, here we go. And then we turn down, we get the squeeze to the downside, stopping out the longs. Again, eventually I do think we will go back and fill the gap up here at 20,400. I'm bullish for now, but NASDAQ stalling at the trend line of resistance. I encourage you to watch this video all the way through. You'll see exactly important resistance levels I'm looking at on the NASDAQ and the S&P 500. The 3-month Treasury yield told us the Fed was behind, that they were about to cut. The reasons why I changed my mind from a quarter to a half, 3-month Treasury yield, and the Fed was behind. In the Fed pivot, which we got today, it's been associated with the bear markets. It's going, oh, no, we're going to have the Fed drop down rates to nothing. No, they're not. They can. Inflation will come back, and they're going to do this QE infinity beyond, and they won't do it later. Start that business up again. Inflation's going to come roaring back. They can't do what they did before. Recession, the prolonged recession that we should have had previously, we're now going to have. Would have been better off if they had just left everything alone. Have the inflation. Yes, we had supply chain disruptions, Fed's QE, and the government's throwing $6 trillion out in stimulus check. All this is inflationary. The government's spending right now, they're spending over $7 trillion a year. Crazy spending. All this is inflationary. This is telling us, hey, we're likely in a topping process, and this is soon going to happen. The VIX got back above the 50 today. Again, if it stays above it, we can get a bigger sell-off, and if we get confirmation to the topping tail, a follow-through, we can get a bigger sell-off and start to see momentum signals shift and maybe trending signals. Now they're still bullish. We did close back above the 50 today, and again, I'll be watching the resistance levels I'm talking about in this video. If we clear them, that's bullish. Confirming these topping tails and start going lower, turning off resistance levels, that's bearish. Stochastics turning back up on the VIX, and again, we did close back above the 50-period moving average. Now, while we didn't get momentum shifting on the daily chart, we did get it in the 4-hour time frame today here on the NASDAQ. We'll need to see trend signals turn bearish if we're going to get a bigger sell-off. get confirmation and a fall through to the topping tail patterns. If we're going to get a bigger sell-off, the RSI has to go negative. But right now, momentum shifting to bearish today with that topping tail and the failed rally above the declining trend line on NASDAQ. We're probably going to get a pullback or a reversal. But like I said, I believe NASDAQ will eventually go fill the gap at 20,400. Again, this is suggesting we're going to see the momentum shift in the daily time frame in all likelihood very soon. If the S&P confirms the topping tail we got on the daily chart and the 60-minute chart here in the 4-hour time frame, then we could see the momentum shift. It didn't shift today, but we did get it with NASDAQ. If we get a confirmation to those topping tails on the intraday charts, on the daily chart, likely see momentum flip on S&P tomorrow, but it did flip on NASDAQ. Even if it flips bearish to get a bigger sell-off, we got to see that RSI go negative. Watching this trend line on the NASDAQ, and again, we tried to get above it twice and it's failed. Again, we got a topping tail here in the 60-minute time frame. I told you we need to clear this level in order to go try to fill the gap immediately. And I told you if we don't, we can pull back, reverse. My guess is, though, eventually we're going to come back and fill the gap at 20,400. We've had a rally going into the Fed pivot here. So again, maybe we see it initially go up, but we'll be watching. I think we eventually will fill this gap. I think we will eventually NASDAQ peak late September, but more likely early to mid-October. Trying to pull back off of this trend line. I told you this trend line, to push above it is a sign of strength, close above it, rejection at it is a sign of weakness, and we're forming diversions at this trend line, trying to get above it a couple of times. Just like S&P tried to get above horizontal resistance a couple of times, and again, it's turning down. Let's take a look at the daily chart. See this trend line, the failed attempts to get above it. Quickly, by the way, Bitcoin is doing the exact same thing NASDAQ is doing. We tried to get above it, excluding the shadow right here, and then we went up to the trend line including the shadow, and we've gotten rejection there for the last 2 days. We had a rally with Larry Fink coming out and going gold, or Bitcoin is digital gold, and people go ooh, and then we rallied right into resistance, horizontal resistance. But Bitcoin and the NASDAQ are both doing the same thing. They're stalling at major resistance. I want to continue to point this out. They have this positive correlation. If we get a bigger pullback with Bitcoin again, I eventually think Bitcoin will go back up into this area, take out this high, fake everybody out, and go towards 68, 69,000 or so, probably early or mid-October, maybe as late as late September there. It might peak first, but I do think it's coming up here, much like what I think NASDAQ is going to rally. But I want to continue, and you don't have to like Bitcoin, you don't have to like cryptocurrency, but you should be aware that, again, this is acting like, a little, or really a NASDAQ ETF on steroids because of the exaggerated moves, but it's doing the exact same thing as the NASDAQ. Got the topping tail on the Dow with the diversions. Topping tail in the form of a shooting star on the S&P at horizontal resistance. Dow at rising resistance. NASDAQ, we got it at declining resistance. Okay, the declining trend line. We tried to get above it. We got a black candlestick yesterday. Tried to get above it today. Went a little bit higher. Couldn't hold on to the gains. NASDAQ ended up down and below that trend line, that divergence on that 60-minute. The 60-minute chart I just showed you. NASDAQ was down 0.45%, down almost 88 points today. And again, it could pull back. We still have the 10 below the 20. Bitcoin got the 10 above the 20. NASDAQ and Bitcoin kind of stalling here, of them around the 50 period, both of them around the trend line. So I'll be watching to see, do we get a bigger pullback and then try to go fill the gap? Again, if you clear the trend line, that's very bullish. If you can close above it, stay above it. You got to have staying power. If we pull back, we can build momentum to get above it. As we will eventually get above it, I think you will eventually fill the gap here near the 20,400 area. I think S&P will move to a new high, complete the topping process. I think that's going to take a few weeks on into early to mid-October in all likelihood. Maybe late September, but my guess is probably early to mid-October. Well, I'm seeing weakness right here because we've had the rally going into the Fed pivot, probably pull back, eventually get a rally to this 20,400 area. NASDAQ has now filled the gap up here from the 16th or 17th. S&P filled it today on an intraday basis as well as yesterday. This is what I think is going on. Again, I think you have this ABC structure, and eventually I think you're going to make your way up here. But right now you're stalling at the trend line of resistance. I've been talking about this trend line for a few days. So we came right up to it. We pulled back and turned down off of it 3 sessions ago. Tested it again, turned down off of it with the black candlestick, and then now topping tail. We got the topping tails on the Dow and on the S&P 500. Got one here, but not really a clean shooting star candlestick like on the Dow and the S&P. But you did get a kind of a sloppy pattern of that same formation. Real body was a little bit smaller, like on the Dow and the S&P. It would be a nice cleaner pattern. Thus, you got a topping tail at this trend line of resistance and a failed breakout 2 days in a row, being off of it 4 sessions ago and not able to get above it. So if we lose the 50 period again, we'll be watching the low over here. I do believe that we are in an ABC move, and I do eventually believe we're going to make our way here. See the market top in all likelihood in the next 2 to 4 weeks or so. And again, when we got the cut, market behaved differently. 2001, 2007, when initially we rallied. We had a rally ahead of it without any kind of really meaningful pullback. So again, if we pull back and then we get a bigger rally, again, I think you could peak in late September, early October, or mid-October. And again, I think when NASDAQ fills this gap, I think S&P will be putting in a top. So that's what I personally believe. Now we're turning off this trend line. So again, we're likely going to get a pullback. And again, if we can build momentum to take out that trend line, then that would be a plus. We're likely in a topping process. Rally leading up into the Fed pivot, we had the S&P rally up into the July high, horizontal resistance, Dow forming, rallying up into major resistance levels on the monthly chart, on the weekly chart, in this multiple point divergence, the S&P going to the horizontal resistance, and then the NASDAQ into the declining trend line, and we've stalled there. This rally ahead of the Fed, probably going to get a pullback. My guess is the S&P has not peaked yet, and I think that we will see it peak early October or mid-October. That'd be my guess, but we're probably going to get a pullback, and then something will happen to where we'll probably see the S&P make a new closing high. Probably go somewhere to the 5750 to 6,000 area. Again, we've got this negative divergence now in the 15-minute time frame. Here's what happened today with the Fed. Initially had a rally. Then we began to sell up. Powell came out. We tried to hang on to it. But by the end of the day, we turned down. So again, I think the divergences are going to give us a pullback. Momentum signals in the daily time frame are still bullish. We'll see if they remain that way with the next pullback or not, or if they turn bearish and then turn back to bullish. And my guess is S&P will not top out until NASDAQ fills the gap at 20,400. Looks like we can get something different than what we had before. And that what we had before, I've shown you the charts where we had the rally Fed, and again in 2001 and 2007, we initially rallied with that. We peaked 17 and then 19 days later, both of those cases. One was a counter trend in 2001. The market had already peaked. The other triggered a top. Still get that here. And again, going into late September on into early to mid-October. It looks like we're going to try to sell off going forward. We'll see if the S&P can try to close at a new all-time high. We've done it on an intraday basis a couple of times now, but not on a closing basis. These divergences on the intraday chart. So again, I think there's a good chance for starting a sell-off with today's highs. Looks like it might be a sell the news event, the short term. 5-minute chart, again, a rally, a sell-off, a rally, and then we got the bigger move with the Fed, formed some divergences, and then had the volatility surrounding Powell's press conference. I just want to show you these intraday charts. Here's how we actually closed. The Dow, again, it was down bigger. The lows of the session had made new intraday highs. It still closed down 103 points, down 0.25%. S&P was down 16.32. It was down 0.29%. The NASDAQ was down 1/3%, down about 50, almost 55 points. The Russell actually was flat. It's gained 3.5%. Look at the S&P 500 60-minute chart. I showed you some of the other intraday charts. They had divergences. We have it here on the S&P as well. Almost 2 equal peaks. This first peak right here, NASDAQ, nicer Class A divergence, more of a Class B divergence there, but now we're getting this Class B, or really confirmation of a lower high. The RSI doesn't look at the tail, but you can see clearly there is a divergence there. It is diverging. And again, we had the divergence over here that gave us a sell-off here. Let me just move this over so you can see the divergence here gave us this sell-off. The divergence here gave us, from the July high, gave us this sell-off. This divergence on the 60-minute chart is likely going to give us some kind of sell-off. Now, again, we came up to this previous high, 56.70, rounding up, and we tried to get above it there. We were above it by 1 point. We turned down off of it, couldn't close there. And today, we tried to get above this level, and it failed, and we turned down. So we'll be watching, eventually try to get a close above the July high. Have come back to fill the gap. NASDAQ hasn't. It will likely go back and fill that gap. S&P already has. Then we got a topping tail here in the 60-minute time frame. A topping tail goes into the rally. We're watching to see if we start a major reversal. Do we start a pullback? We're still going to eventually try to make a new closing high above the July peak. Eventually, that will happen. Getting back to gains for the week, and remember, we had a rally the previous 2 weeks into the Fed decision, so we might pull back here. Actually, again, as I've talked about, I think we're headed up into this trend line right here. I've slightly excluded the shadows there. We can include the shadows maybe a little higher. That takes us towards the trend lines I've been talking about on the monthly chart. I went into it in great length of detail in yesterday's video. I'll link that at the end of this video. Go watch it. I don't have time to show you today. I think these divergences are under construction. We will get a close here above this level. Now, maybe it plays out differently than it has in the past. We've rallied after the first rate cut for 3.5 weeks or just under 4. Talked about this at great length and detail. We rallied for 17 and 19 days. It's different. Maybe we just rally for a week or two and get something more like this, where again we get this close to a new high, a push to test it, and we start a reversal, and you get you go above this level for a couple of weeks rather than multiple weeks. But again, I'm looking for a topping process. Very well could be topping. I think the S&P is going to eventually come up here. NASDAQ will eventually fill the gap at 20,400. The Dow could be topping right now, as I've talked about at great length and detail in nearly every video. Compare this 60-minute chart, and again, the topping tail we got, and we're trying to get above it. Compare that to the daily, which also got a topping tail. Now, again, we didn't close above the July high. We've made 2 attempts to do it. We got that black candlestick yesterday. Now we get a topping tail in the form of a shooting star. Do we get a bigger sell-off or reversal? We still have the 10 below the 20 period here. To get above this trend line twice now, this trend line from the peak here and the peak over here, and it's failed. We got a black candlestick, and then we got the topping tail. It cleared the July high twice, and it's failed twice. You had a divergence over here, give us this sell-off. The divergence over here, give us this sell-off. And now you've got potentially a larger divergence. Give us another sell-off if we get a sell the news event here with the Fed. S&P stalling at the horizontal resistance. A topping tail and a shooting star. Very similar candlesticks on NASDAQ and the Dow. Dow getting a shooting star candlestick. It moved to a new high, but it's forming this multiple point divergence. Again, I told you the Dow could very well be topping, and you have this divergence on the MACD as well. Also diverging with the transports, but big rally on the Dow with the release of the rate decision, but you couldn't hold on to the gains. And you got a topping tail. So could we see a follow or confirmation to this bar and start seeing a sell-off with the Dow with this divergence playing out? And again, I continue to point out we're at major resistance in the monthly time frame and the weekly time frame for the Dow. This is NASDAQ turned off its monthly trend line, which I talked about yesterday. And these trend lines in the weekly time frame, again, this is going back to the pandemic low. The Dow's doing the same thing. It's turning off a major trend line of resistance in the turning off major resistance in the weekly time frame. Real fast, before I show you the Dow, again, NASDAQ has bounced off this trend line in the linear time frame. If we take out these lows, this trend line is very, very important. Again, eventually, I think we come back and fill the gap at 20,400 up here. Don't know if we take this low out, but again, signals are stalling at the trend line of resistance on NASDAQ, which I'll show you in a moment. I wanted to show you this trend line because I think it's important here in the weekly time frame. I use both linear and log scaling. The log scaling did a great job in the top resistance. This trend line did a really good job in marking this bottom here that we had. Dow's still up 0.25% for the week. It's still up 106 points or so, but we're getting a topping tail. I think it could be that way by the end of the week. We're hitting this trend line, including the shadow right here. And again, don't forget we're slamming up into major long-term resistance, 125-year trend line. Possibly be the Dow peaks before the S&P 500. I think NASDAQ has already peaked, as I've said. NASDAQ will end up getting a lower high. It is diverging with the NASDAQ. The Dow's made a new high. The NASDAQ has not. S&P is trying to make new intraday highs. The Russell is not. They're diverging from one another. Look at those diversions. Sellers are at the trend line here. Keep telling you, again, I told you with this peak, telling you here with this peak here this week with this rally, again, we could be witnessing the Dow peaking in a major top that we won't see these levels for the next decade. That's what valuations are telling us. Oh, that's not possible. You've got the market cap to GDP at around 200%, saying the market is so overvalued there's going to be a great reset. Same thing with the Shiller PE. These are market valuations. No, I know the experts are telling us we're not going to have a recession. But the indicators are, even if Claudia Sahm wants to ignore her indicator, buy into the propaganda because she was on these shows, her indicator has been correct for decades. I'll believe her indicator any day of the week over the propaganda on the financial channels and this soft landing fairy tale nonsense. Again, I think the Dow could be topping, as I continue to say. Diversions down here on the MACD forming. By the time it rolls over, again, we'll already have topped and started turning down sharply. I think the S&P is going to go higher, but the Dow could peak first. Oftentimes, that's the way it works. Momentum is still bullish on the S&P daily chart. The stochastic rolled over today, so again, we're probably going to turn with that topping tail and try to confirm it here before the weekends on Thursday or Friday. We need confirmation and a fall through. We need to drop back below the 10-period moving average if we're going to get a sell-off. Right now, you can see, again, things are green. You see the little blue arrow. You see the little green cloud, the blue bars. I showed you that we're stalling at resistance, so we're probably going to get a pullback. Like I said, eventually, I think S&P will go and make a new closing high in the next few weeks as NASDAQ eventually makes its way back up to 20,400 to fill the gap. It's stalling at that trend line of resistance right now where it's probably going to pull back. Stochastic turning bearish, MACD forming a divergence, and we probably will see red bars Thursday or Friday here on the Awesome Oscillator. Momentum does shift and we lose the 10 period, the red line right there, then we can get a bigger pullback. Remember, the 10 is still below the 20. Watching to see if we drop back below them, come back and test these lows, or it's something worse. But like I said, I do think we will get a close and fill the gap on a closing basis, not just an intraday basis from the July peak, which was, again, done on an intraday basis the last few days. That was from back over here, which was... let's see, what's the date on that? We gapped lower on the 17th. The peak was on the 16th. I talked about the diversions here where S&P went higher, but NASDAQ didn't. NASDAQ peaked on the 10th, which, again, I believe NASDAQ's already peaked. I think once it fills the gap at 20,400, I think S&P will have its peak. But, again, behaving a little bit like a sell the news event here with the Fed pivot. Markets, again, rather than celebrating a jumbo hike they were hoping for, now starting to question, well, why does the Fed feel the need to do that? Going on with the labor market, Powell's telling us how wonderful the labor market is, and methinketh he protesteth too much. It's not as good as he's saying, and he has shown concerns about it. Again, I do think we'll end up going higher and forming this larger divergence. We had this one. I think we're getting another one here with the Awesome Oscillator and the MACD. We're weeks away from a top. I think you'll peak, you'll get a reversal, and you'll get the ushering into the bear market. Right now, signals are suggesting a pullback based on the topping tails on the daily charts and the 60-minute charts. So rally that we had with the Fed pivot has now fizzled. Weekly chart of the S&P here. And for the NASDAQ, you're getting the green bars, but I told you again, I think that we end up getting a lower high, probably pulling back off that trend line first. I think we'll break out above it and go fill the gap at 20,400 eventually, probably by early to mid-October. And then I think you get your market top with a lower high on NASDAQ. Again, I think the Dow is trying to peak right now. I think NASDAQ already peaked July 10th. The S&P is yet to peak. And we're getting the stochastic turning down on the daily chart here, just touching that signal line. The S&P is rolling below it here. Again, we're getting a lower high at the trend line of resistance. And here the 10 is still below the 20, so we could get a bigger pullback, and we're turning off the trend line. Watching to see if we start getting red awesome oscillator bars. We'll be watching to see if we take out these 10-period moving averages. Continue to turn off of that trend line. On the NASDAQ, I'll be watching the low over here for a test. You take it out, you have your 200 period there at 18,260. Said eventually, I do think NASDAQ will fill the gap at 20,400, but right now it continues to stall at the trend line of resistance as we've seen in this video. We can clear that level immediately, that's bullish. If we get rejection here as we're doing, that's bearish. Build momentum to break the downward trend line. We'll be watching NASDAQ very closely. Along with the Bitcoin trend line, again, they're doing the exact same thing.